year is a long time from now, but you're still alive. On your normal commute, you notice stores that put out colorful signs signifying the importance of the day. You see your social media follow suit. Everyone's sharing a documentary here, the story of a life lost there. Like Friday the 13th, this date has significance in the broader culture, carries baggage that, unlike Friday the 13th, isn't superstitious. You anticipate the typical lines from politicians and public figures alike. This day marks tragedy that the modern world has never seen. This day, we became aware of pure evil. This day, we remember the lives lost. Today is the day of no return, a federal holiday. You remember this means you have the day off because you're unemployed. So you decide to head to your typical pub, the one you've been going to since before this holiday existed. At the pub, the news is playing, and expectedly, they give condolences to the victims and survivors of today's tragedy. Everyone in the bar nods along, saying how this event was inexcusable, evil, unheard of depravity done by monsters. There are museums, memorials, textbooks, national holidays, all to acknowledge this tragedy as a proper society should. It's odd to have a differing opinion. To deny that this was terrible or defend the monsters who did it is heavily frowned upon as a major breach of the social contract or human contract, as many are saying nowadays, especially today when everyone is either performing or experiencing best they can a kind of sadness, but also gratitude. Today is the day that people were nearly eradicated, but today is also the day everyone acknowledges or is thankful that we now live in a better world. Everyone except you. Because you remember being in this pub when it was happening. Those people are awful for what they did. Genocide is never justified. Says the same one who said the victims were not fighting for freedom. That they were not victims since they held guns in defense of bombs. Amen. Chimes in the self-avowed centrist who at the time of this genocide was admittedly not into politics and conveniently defended the genociders. Thank God we're in better times, says the bartender who was very vocal about their annoyance with the protesters who dared stand up for those they now acknowledge as victims, but then called savages. You remember wondering why savages deserve to be bombed while in the hospital, and if savages deserve to die at all. You remember the one who doesn't come to the pub as much, bragging about reporting their neighbor for harboring one of them and how they're going to spend the reward. You also remember how some people inquired on how to do it themselves. God, those poor children, said the former teacher, now principal, who insisted that the victims were savages, that their children were not children, but soldiers, that they are not people, but barbarians. You remember hearing of the raids and them saying they were harboring terrorists. You remember hearing that children were killed and that it was not the fault of the soldier, not the fault of who gave them the orders, but the fault of the parents for not teaching their children that a rock thrown means a bullet, a tank, an airstrike returned, for not teaching their child that they don't own their home, but the military does, and that if they try to return, they will be killed. You remember how they dismiss anything that wasn't coded in pleasantry, how they dismiss any response to this tragedy they now acknowledge as genocide, as nonsense, how they couldn't fathom the violence the savages used, but somehow understood that it required they be eliminated with weapons they have no access to. You remember them looking at dead children and not batting an eye. You remember they called them future terrorists. You remember them nodding along as the death toll climbed. You remember the old drunk sharing conspiracies that the child begging for their life was an actor, that all of them were coached into performing anguish. You remember when they were savages and not victims. You remember them all saying this tragedy they now acknowledge as genocide was necessary. Back then, you got dirty looks for showing support for the savages, scoffed at for saying that borders moving, expanding is inherently violent, called alarmists for saying the word genocide. That is, until it became undeniable, the harm being done to those previously called savages. You come to realize the only difference between genocide and war, between terrorist and freedom fighter, between savage and victim, between being alarmist and being correct, is time. That was for those of you who keep asking to hear more of my own thoughts and words or whatever. It was heavily inspired and guided by One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This by Omar El Akkad. And some lines are pulled directly from information I learned while reading that book. What you just heard was what I thought the book would be. For some reason, I was expecting more speculative fiction based on the day everyone wakes up and sees what's happening for what it is. Turns out it's more autobiographical. I was way off, but still a great read. But moving on, I also read Create Dangerously by Camus. Let me tell you, this is my artist's Bible. And for some reason, Camus has been yelling inside my head about my responsibility as an artist, especially nowadays, which is to create dangerously. This is something I think all creatives need to be engaging in, especially right now, because art is in danger of becoming void and propaganda. Where tyranny rises, art is defanged and robbed of its soul. This lecture was given in a historical time period very similar to the one we're in now, making it terribly relevant. To create today means to create dangerously. Every publication is a deliberate act, and that act makes us vulnerable to the passions of a century that forgives nothing. And so, the question is not to know whether taking action is or is not damaging to art. The question, to everyone who cannot live without art and all it signifies, is simply to know, given the strict controls of countless ideologies, how the enigmatic freedom of creation remains possible. The artists who preceded us had doubts, but what they doubted was their own talent. Artists of today doubt whether their art and therefore their very existence is even necessary. Real, but what's the relation to all this political stuff? Can't you just make stuff to take our minds off this tragedy? This artist will not. Artists are often asked to keep politics out of art. Camus thinks this is bullshit, and so do I. What this means and is always truly meant is not to agitate the status quo, not to agitate the norms and sensitivities of the state and its defenders. Art for art's sake, the entertainment of a solitary artist is indeed the artificial art of a facetious and self-absorbed society. The logical result of such a theory is the art of little cliques, or the purely formal art fed on affections and abstractions, and ending in the destruction of all reality. And this reminds me of Du Bois' work on the spectacle. He also said when societies become symbols, we remove ourselves from reality, or create or presented with a faux reality. This faux reality is made of symbols and is there to reinforce the status quo, reinforce capitalism, loyalty to nation, and the assigned God. I go into the spectacle more in my madness video if you need a more complex discussion, but again, the spectacle is described in very similar language. As a result of rejecting everything, even the tradition of his art, the contemporary artist gets the illusion that he is creating his own rule and eventually takes himself for God. At the same time, he thinks he can create his reality himself, but cut off from his society, he will create nothing but formal or abstract works, thrilling as experiences, but devoid of the fecundity we associate with true art, which is called upon to unite. And fecundity refers to the ability to reproduce or repopulate yourself or something like that. I don't know. Check Google. I just be saying shit for real. Reality cannot be reproduced without exercising a selection. The only thing needed then is to find a principal choice that will give shape to the world. And such a principle is found not in the reality we know, but in the reality that will be, in short, the future. In order to reproduce properly what is, one must also depict what will be. Okay, that one was a little more hard to understand. But basically here he's saying that art can't be made without selecting things from what we know. And art should be trying to be both future-oriented, so visionary, but also it should show or depict the past and present. Art should inspire, or motivate change, and being imaginative about how the present can look or should look or shouldn't look is true art. Don't quote me, I just be saying shit for real. Art is neither complete rejection nor complete acceptance of what is. It is simultaneously rejection and acceptance. The artist constantly lives in such a state of ambiguity, incapable of negating the real, and yet eternally bound to question it in its eternally unfinished aspects. Yeah, that's kind of what I said, right? The aim of art, on the contrary, is not to legislate or to reign supreme, but rather to understand. No work of genius has ever been based on hatred and contempt. This is why for the artist, at the end of his slow advance, instead of being a judge, he is a justifier. He is a perpetual advocate of the living creature because it is alive. Let me read that again. It's a perpetual advocate of the living creature because it is alive. What that was I said earlier about savages not deserving to die or something? Art, by virtue of that free essence, unites where tyranny separates. It is not surprising that artists and intellectuals should have been the first victims of modern tyrants. Tyrants know there is in the work of art an emancipatory force which is mysterious only to those who do not revere it. Let me read that one again too, that's a bar. Tyrants know there is in the work of art an emancipatory force is mysterious only to those who do not revere it. Every great work makes the human face more admirable and richer, and this is its whole secret. And thousands of concentration camps and barred cells are not enough to hide this staggering testimony of dignity. Good art is not based in cruelty, but empathy and understanding for human beings. Artists are here to remind us that everyone is human and life is more complex than savage and civilian, that these terms let us separate the humanity of the so-called savages. Because the artist knows that they are the savage when power says their art is a threat. The artist becomes savage when the state needs propaganda, but the artist only speaks truth. The artist reminds us that we are savages too. Anyway, send this to someone who needs it. Keep making stuff and be.